the funny thing is I'm a kind of a private person. And that's one of my hesitations about writing the book was like, ooh, I got to write about myself. Because originally when I was writing, I didn't want it to be like a typical history book where you're just talking about the stories. I wanted to be able to share and make it different, and share like what I thought when I was reading the stories. To kind of make it a little more relatable. I thought about my nephew.
What's up, Capwatids? We're back.
It's your favorite Ates, and welcome to season 4.
For those just tuning in, we are two Filipinx soul sisters on a decolonizing journey, currently based on Turtle Island, aka North America.
We met each other again this lifetime in a healing circle, and that's how the Babaylan Bruhas Book Club podcast was born.
This season, we did something a little different by engaging in a series of study break conversations with honored artists, authors, and thought leaders in the Filipinx diaspora.
We enjoyed connecting with Kapwa with different perspectives and viewpoints, and we're so excited to extend these conversations to you.
We are grateful to connect with this next individual, Ate Judy Robinson, author of 1521, Rediscovering the History of the Philippines.
We learned more about the inception and publishing process of the book, and it was such a treat to speak with her as we just completed season 3 with her work. With that said, let's dive in. All right. Hello, everybody. Today we have a special guest with us today. We have Ate Judy Robinson, who wrote the book from the previous season, 1521, Rediscovering the History of the Philippines. So we're going to get into a wonderful little chat. Should be fun. But as always, before we begin, we want to take a moment to ground. So taking a pause to drop into our bodies and become fully present to this space. So if it is safe for you, if you are not driving, we invite you to close your eyes, straighten your spine, and direct your focus onto your breath. If you cannot close your eyes, I just encourage you to tune into your breathing, maybe just still your thoughts and come into your body. Take a few deep inhales, extending your belly out, and exhales, bringing your belly in. One more inhale, extending your belly out, and exhale, bringing your belly in. And one more time, inhale, extending your belly out. And exhale, bringing your belly in. Connect back into your body, into this moment. Extend gratitude to your body. Try not to think about earlier or later today. Just can you allow yourself to feel what it is like to be in the here and now moment? And as we begin our conversation, we'd like to thank God, Bathala, Creator, for another gathering. In gratitude, we acknowledge our benevolent ancestors and invite all these forces to guide and protect this conversation today. We also thank the ancestors of the land Stephanie and I currently occupy, knowing we cannot do our own remembrance work without remembering them. For me, that is the mound builders that are the Hopewell and Adena people in Ohio. And for Stephanie, that is the Bay, Miwok, Yokot people in the Inland Bay area of California. With gratitude, we also acknowledge your presence, Kapwatid, your energy and your light, no matter wherever and whenever you're tuning in. All right.
Thank you, sis. It's a good way to always get back into this moment. But yeah, so we're so excited to have Ate Judy here. And I know Imee and I have been talking to y'all about 1521 for a while. And it's just been such a wonderful way to have someone in the community that is, actively trying to support us in remembering our history. So welcome, Ate Judy. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited to dive in today and just learn more about you, where you've been, where you are, and where you want to be. But first, would you like to just introduce yourself to our listeners, who you are, what you do, and what came about this book?
So hello, everyone. I'm Judy Robinson. I wrote the book 1521, Rediscovering the History of the Philippines. And, I grew up in the Philippines, and we learned about the 1521, the Europeans coming to the Philippines. And the way we originally learned it, like back in the day, was that Magellan discovered the Philippines. And so when I wrote the book, I was thinking of like, well, what part of Philippine history, what do I want to write about? And retrieving this 1521 because of the 500-year anniversary. And so the play on the Europeans discovering the Philippines, and for me was rediscovering the stories from our history. And obviously it's changed nowadays. I think even in the US, how they learned about Columbus arriving in the US has also changed, that, it wasn't all this about exploration and discovery. There were actually people that were living there. Our ancestors, the pre-colonial Filipinos, were there. And growing up, the stories were that they were more, the ones we learned was that Magellan arrived, the Filipinos, because they arrived because they wanted to Christianize or convert people to Christianity. And then the Filipinos converted, and that was it. But there's actually a lot more nuance to the story. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about in the book, was what wasn't really about Christianity, was really more about the spices.
Yeah.
It was more economic, was the reason for going out there and kind of discovering the Philippines by accident. Right. Although some historians, like William Henry Scott, one of them, just reading from his book, he kind of hinting that Magellan knew where he wanted to go. So there's different historians that now say like he probably knew where he wanted to go, which was to the Philippines, but he didn't know the way to go about it, the route that he went, which was going a different direction from where Portugal would go.
Right.
So I think it's kind of all these little stories that fascinated me, rather than the big, broad brushstrokes of history that we learn about, like, here's what happened, but really more of like, here are the little things that happened, the little characters that we don't know about, like Enrique, his slave, that I didn't even know about. Like, it was not in our history textbooks, right? Like, I learned history from Philippine history, but this was not mentioned at all.
Yeah.
Maybe I was a bad student. Who knows?
No, the way you write, I'm sure you were not a bad student.
And it's funny, so I was wondering, like, was it me? Was I a bad student? So I had to ask my friend, Janie, who also grew up in the Philippines. She lives here in the US now. She lives in Pennsylvania. So I told her, like, hey, I wanted to write this book about the history of the Philippines. Can you and I read these books together and have discussions like what you, Stephanie and Imee are doing together as a podcast? But this was like a book club of one, two, I guess, her and I, like, comparing notes. And that's when I was like, so it wasn't just me who didn't know these stories, but other Filipinos did not know them as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting that you mentioned like all the different characters. I think Stephanie and I were really, I don't know why we were drawn to the Enrique character. We're like, we keep mentioning like somebody should make this a movie. Somebody should make this a movie. And
probably happening.
Yeah, maybe it's already happening. But yeah, I was like, the Enrique character, let's make the movie about him. And
I know.
Have all the major things happening around. But yeah, it was really, it's been really eye-opening, honestly, to read. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't actually Magellan. It was Legazpi who claimed it finally. So that was where we're at right now.
Okay.
And I thought
that last time I was listening to your podcast, you were in the chapter with Legazpi arriving in the Philippines.
Yeah. Okay. So it was very like sobering because all this time the tale of like Magellan, Lapu-Lapu, is I think just recently permeating like the Filipinx like awareness of what really happened and who killed Magellan, and And in some ways, like your writing helped us be compassionate to Magellan. You know, even though like,
yeah,
there's probably, if it was like put in movie form and all the pillaging was shown, maybe not, but you know, it's still like considering the transatlantic slave route, the, you know, push for e-commerce or commercial gain and enterprise. And that's really what, you know, man, I think you got a chapter, God, Gold, and Glory. It's just classic human nature. So, but we were just wondering, you know, since Babaylan and we are women of color, millennial, just like, I wonder if a woman historian was on this ship and how that would be different lens to consider.
Oh yeah.
Like, yeah, I think for sure. And I think it's sad, right, that like women and slaves were not considered in the stories. I don't know if they probably weren't in the original ships, but they did, in one of the chapters, I did mention that there were couples that arrived in the Philippines, which I didn't even know this. Like Legazpi wrote to the king of Spain and said like, hey, can you send 50 married couples to the Philippines, because Filipinos were kind of worried about all these Spaniards arriving in the islands without their wives, without women. Yeah. So 50 couples arrived, and that's when the encomienda system started, where they partitioned the land. It was originally supposed to be, the idea behind it is that they're supposed to like, when they convert to Christianity, they could be like their mentors in the Christian faith. That's what I understood it to be. But that's where abuses kind of started coming in. And and as you read that chapter, you'll kind of see that the chiefs and their eldest son were, because everybody had to pay tribute. The men had to pay tribute as part of this encomienda system. But the chiefs and their eldest son were excluded from having to pay tribute. And so some of them became the tribute collectors. And so that's kind of like how it started with abuses, because it was either a form of labor or something material.
Interesting.
Yeah, so, I think like we just thinking about our ancestors. Yeah. This happened like 500 years ago, and you know, the Philippines didn't really gain independence from Spain until 1896. And then we didn't gain become the Republic of the Philippines until 1946.
Right.
And that's how recent that is. Our ancestors, our grandparents, they went through a lot of things, like the changing, the Spanish American War, and then the you know, the Japanese and American War. So there's all these like intergenerational things happening. I think that was kind of interesting. I always wondered about that with our ancestors. Like, I don't know about your grandparents, but my grandparents didn't really talk about the war. Yeah. But they usually would say like, oh, you know, during my time, it was hard. And, you know, I would just roll, you know, when we were kids, you would like roll our eyes like, oh, here goes Lola again with all the things that happened when she was young. But now, like, I'm older and wiser, I realized like, oh yeah, it must have been really hard.
Yeah. Rob's Lolo, my partner's Lolo, he was alive during that time, and he would talk about when martial law was in effect. And so, you know, we were kind of asking him questions. It's just interesting because I feel like the few elders that I have had the privilege of talking to about like past stuff and their experiences in the Philippines, I feel like, you know, they haven't even processed it. They're just surviving. Oh, we're here in martial law. That's just what we had to do. We had to go back inside at a certain time, and they're just like they're living and surviving it. So it's not like they like process like, why is this happening and what is the history and the systems and things. So yeah, that's very interesting. But I wanted to ask you, so what was the journey to, okay, I'm just going to write about 1521. Like, has it been like brewing in your mind for years, or was it just like a burst of inspiration, or what was like the real turning point where you're like, you know what, I am going to do this. I'm going to write a book.
Well, it was during COVID And I think we were all in lockdown. My husband and I don't have kids. We have our dogs. I needed some kind of project to keep me like grounded and sane. I mean, I did try the baking route. So I ordered one of those stand-up mixers. My sisters did all the baking, and I'm not in the family. It's kind of known that I'm not a very good cook, not even a good baker.
Okay.
So I was like, all right, well, I guess I'll try something different. My husband wrote a book actually called My Unremarkable Brain. It's about epilepsy and the keto diet.
Oh.
And so I was like, oh, you know what? Maybe I should I need a project just to keep me busy. So I thought about writing a book. There's a program at Georgetown University for new authors.
Okay.
So I joined that program to kind of help me have some structure, have some accountability, because I have an editor that I have to like submit written work to. There's deadlines. And I was thinking about the topic. It was my brother that actually said to me, like, why don't you write about 1521?
Oh, okay.
And in the book, I talk about like how I was kind of like, what 1521? And it's true that when he said, why don't you write about 1521? I was like, well, why? And he said, well, it's the 500-year anniversary.
Yeah.
And I kind of realized like, oh my God, it has been 500 years since 1521. So that kind of planted the idea of the 1521 story. In the beginning, I was like, oh, it's going to be easy, you know, adventure, Magellan, arriving in the Philippines, Christianizing everybody. And then when I started actually reading the book, I went and looked for books about Magellan or the journey, because there's not a lot about the Philippines itself, about what happened in the Philippines.
Right.
So I read this book by this American historian, Lawrence Bergreen.
Right.
And that's when I was like, oh, wait, there's Enrique. And I was like, okay, like, who is this Enrique? Like, I've never heard of him. And I really focused on the part where he arrived in the Philippines. There's all these little backstories, little stories that I didn't know about. The fact that there was negotiation between the Filipinos, the Cebuanos, I guess the people, the Cebu Islanders, Humabon.
Yeah.
There was this negotiation back and forth. Like growing up, it was just like, okay, they arrived and everybody just converted.
Right.
It wasn't that simple.
Right.
Again, I go back and say like, was it me? And Janny and I would have this conversation like, oh my God, like we didn't know this. And originally my scope was really very broad. I wanted to write about 1521 and started going on these rabbit holes about Philippines history in general. But I had to narrow it down just to 1521 because there's just so many stories about Philippine history.
Yeah.
And you can't just write it all in one book. So I had to focus on just 1521. But that was like the jumping off point for me, because really that's where, you know, our ancestors were oral historians. So it was mostly storytelling passed on from one generation to the next. Right. So if the Spaniards had arrived and Pigafetta had not written about what happened during their journey, we may not even know about these stories today.
Yeah.
I wonder how you get all this information. So, you know, everyone loves citations, and she has them, y'all, sits in the back. But I guess, like you said, you went to school in the Philippines. So what did you study? And then you said that you gathered information with your friend. You did the book club, like you two. And then but you cite a lot of historians. So how did you gather all your material and kind of connect the dots?
I started with that first book by Lawrence Bergreen, and he also had to cite his sources. And I think that was the hard part too, because there were some things that I know, like certain, like, you know, Filipino traditions that I would know. And then my editor would say, well, where's your source on this? And I'm like, I just know because we know.
Yeah.
So I had to like actually find sources, say like, okay, here's what it said. This academic paper said this and this and that. So starting with that first historian, and he cited his sources. So I looked at his sources to go looking through. And that's when I found Blair and Robertson's accounts, which it was just really just translations of documents during that time. It's like 55 volumes. And I've really just barely scratched the surface of all the stories about the Philippines. I think that Pigafetta, the way he wrote the story of Magellan's journey was meant for other people to read it. So it's very engaging. He writes of Magellan as being, this character. And so that was very helpful because it really formed the story. And there were some parts that I didn't include in the book because my editor said, like, okay, it's really too long. You have to edit out some stories and kind of try to keep it to some kind of, at least something that's easy, a lot more easier to understand. No, not too many characters that's confusing for people. So I started with that one book, and then from there went to other books. Some that I even didn't get to include in the book. There was one book that Janny and I read together because I was like, I'm having a hard time. Like it was more academic. When it came to like more academic books, I was like, I need somebody to discuss this with, because that's how I learn best when I'm discussing it with somebody. And I realized that reading through one of these history books, that Filipinos also learn through stories best. There was a book written by somebody called Tomas Pinpin. It was the first maybe Tagalog book, or first book written by a Filipino for Filipinos during the Spanish colonial period.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I never heard of it. And it was just really interesting, like hearing these stories about how Filipinos were trying to survive and thrive with this new environment they faced themselves in. It's just the resilience of Filipino people. And, it starts from like, even before the Spaniards arrived or the Europeans arrived in the Philippines, like looking about just the geography of the islands, all the natural, like the threats that we have, earthquakes, typhoons, kind of starts with that. So I kind of wanted to build that into like, that's why I started with those early chapters, kind of giving an introduction to the Philippines, and also for non-Filipino readers.
Right.
Because the other thing I wanted to do with the book was to kind of open up Philippine history to non-Filipino readers, especially like members of the diaspora, like yourselves, maybe, that you've kind of not really heard about Philippine history before.
Yeah.
Some Filipinos who learn Philippine history might not find the book very helpful because they know about these things. But if you're interested in learning about the little nuances, the stories, the little stories of the different characters that were not included in the textbooks, I think that would be what would make it interesting.
Yeah. That like I said before, the different characters and just the nuance, we talk about that a lot. Like, it's so nuanced. It's not just like like you said before, like Magellan came and then everyone was converted. It just brings a lot of depth and humanity to everyone in the story, including our ancestors, right? So I wanted to ask you, in your research, what was maybe one of the things you came across that surprised you, that you didn't know, or you felt like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense, or something that was like, oh my gosh, one of those
like an aha moment.
Yeah, aha moment. Thank you.
Yeah. It's actually in the last chapter of the book, which is one of my favorite chapters.
Okay.
This connection that we have with water.
Okay.
That's something that's, even before the Spanish came, that's something that's pre-colonial Filipinos have. It's kind of very weird. And it was about how we wash our feet.
Okay.
And when you read that chapter, I talk about the connection with water and how our ancestors love bathing and showering. I don't know if you guys feel the same, but I do.
Yeah.
Our family does. We all love like showering, and maybe it's a Filipino thing that we shower how many times a day. In one of the Spanish accounts described that Filipinos kind of wash their feet very meticulously, where they rub one foot on top of the other. And I was like, oh, like okay, that's how I wash my feet. Like, I rub one foot on top of the other, and then when there's water, like, when you're coming from the beach, for example, sand, you kind of rub one foot on top of the other. So I thought that was kind of like, oh, that's weird. Like, I do that. Is that learned behavior? But it's something that pre-colonial Filipinos did. So I asked my husband, like, hey, is that how you wash your feet? And he said, like, well, no, why can't you use your hands to like get the sand off? And I'd be like, well, then your hands get dirty. So I had to ask my friend Janny, like, is that how you wash your feet? And she said, like, yeah, I know. I don't think there's any other way. So I've asked other Filipinos now, like, is that how you wash your feet? Like one foot on top of the other, like rubbing your feet together, one foot on top of the other. And it seems to be consensus. I don't know if you guys do that.
I don't know. Maybe it's like if you grew up in the Philippines versus anywhere in the diaspora, because I live in the Midwest, and so our feet aren't out all the time. Like most of the time they're in our socks. There's no need to wash them really. But yeah, that's interesting. How about you, sis? Do you wash your feet like that?
I haven't been to the one beach in a while, and that's sad. But I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. That's a good.
I gotta ask. We should ask our titas, and
I'll ask my mom. Yeah,
it's your mom.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I think there were a lot of like, to me, it was just, again, like going through this whole journey of finding these stories. I had a lot of like, aha, or like, whoa, I didn't know that moments. Mm-hmm. And that's when I felt like, when I was reading through the books, I was like, oh, my nephews and nieces would really appreciate this. Because they don't know this, and I didn't know them myself. I felt it was great to be able to share stories.
I'm so curious, you as being, sounds like in your family, one kind of, breaking into the pre-colonial history, and how is your lifestyle in terms of like, do you go to Christian church, and knowing the information, like how does that impact you or your family? Because for me, like my great-great-grandmother would say, we're Catholic, all the way through and through. And so I'm kind of the first, like maybe some of our listeners who are just like kind of, I don't want to say struggling, but sometimes just feeling challenged about practicing something that was very much imposed on us. So
yeah, it's true. I mean, I went to a Catholic school from kindergarten through high school. It was a Jesuit-run school, and I feel like they were somewhat progressive, maybe compared to the other orders. But I mean, again, it's something my especially on my father's side was very Catholic. Mm-hmm. I think they were like typical Filipino families where you have lots of kids. One of them would be a priest, one of them with this. There would be like the titas who are old maids, never got married. There was very typical. But I think that we kind of all find spirituality in our own ways. I go to like church every now and then. Like I'm one of those CNE Christians or Catholics.
Christmas, Easter only.
Something like that. It does kind of bring family together. I remember like it was what we did with when nephews and nieces were younger. We would all go to mass, midnight mass. And then Santa would come. So that was like part of our little ritual.
Yeah, right.
Was an excuse for us to get out of the house so that Santa could come to the house. But I do feel that, it's interesting you mentioned this. I'm reading this book that you might like. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass.
Oh, yeah.
It's indigenous wisdom. Mm-hmm. The first chapter talks about what the indigenous people kind of believe, something called Sky Woman falling is the first chapter. And they believe that the world was created by the Sky Woman fell out of the sky, and the animals like saw her falling, and they kind of, instead of her falling into the water, they rescued her. So she fell on like a swan's back or something, but she needed land. So the animals all banded together to help her build land. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that struck me about this chapter was when she explained how the children of Eve, which if you're Catholic, then you're one of the children of Eve, right? There's a belief that we're aiming towards this paradise in the afterlife. Whereas for them, like Sky Woman fell and she came to Earth and she kind of took care of the land. So this is your new home now.
Yeah.
You take care of the current land where you are. So like different points of view. And I kind of feel, oh yeah, I'm kind of both, right? I believe in spirituality. I believe in God. There's higher power. I've had many instances in my life where I felt like, oh yes, there is somebody there kind of looking out for us. So I think it's really what you believe in. That's what I would say. But I mean, that's one of the things that about 1521, when I asked my brother, like, what about, because everyone was kind of like not sure what to do about the 1521 anniversary, right? It was like, oh, should we celebrate it? Like colonization happened. What do we do? But then Christianity, I mean, have you guys, when was the last time you were in the Philippines?
Long time ago when I was like 14. So it's been a while. I was born there, but then I was raised here. So yeah.
I mean, the Philippines is still very much a Christian and Catholic country, but I think now it's becoming more diverse.
Mm-hmm. I think too, because Mindanao, there's a lot of Muslim population there, or the practice of it, and I have family down there, so I haven't been able to connect with them just yet. I was there right before the lockdown, like February of 2020. And I went to Manila and Boracay, and that was really all I got to witness. But yeah, it's definitely an archipelago. It's a lot, like a plane, a boat, a jeepney, like just to get to a hotel. And it is kind of sad. You pass through the third world looking areas, a lot of shanties, and so it's a little confusing. And then they do look at you as an American, Filipino or Filipino American, and they'll chase you down on the beach trying to sell you things. And so I don't know, it was it's again archipelagos. I want to go back, but I think I'd have to take like a year sabbatical or something.
I mean, there's so many islands to discover.
Yeah. Where in the Philippines is your family from, Ate?
So I have family in Manila and also down south in Davao.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah.
So I guess one of the things that I'm curious about with your experience of growing up in the Philippines and then moving here, what is one major difference that you see between like Filipinos who grew up in the Philippines and then, us here, like American Filipinos here in the diaspora, like I don't know, what am I trying to ask? Like differences or like surprises or things you're like, oh, that's interesting. We don't see it that way, or we don't do things that way, etc.
I think that the Filipino culture is so strong about like family. So I think I would say I would look at the similarities more.
Okay.
Like,
yeah.
There's this strong like family bond, right? I mean, like we all get together, like even if it's Thanksgiving, and we call them all bring our own Filipino I mean, there's always rice at every family gathering. Even if you grew up in the Philippines or you grew up in the States or wherever, anywhere in the world, if you're Filipino, there's going to be rice for sure. And then there's this like family of like just togetherness. And even with, I'm sure the friends of your parents are also Filipino. There's like tito, tita, they're like extended family for you. That's kind of what I found very similar. If it's in the Philippines or it's here in the US, there's still that togetherness and family.
It's still very much like a collectivist culture. We're very community, village.
We're very community oriented. And always like helping each other, which is kind of great. I mean, my wish is that in the Super Bowl next year, maybe they'll feature all Filipino American artists. There's a lot. But hopefully.
I know.
Right?
Well, where are you from, Ate Judy? Like, where are you in the States?
I'm in the Washington, D.C. area.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you're in the capital.
Yes.
And how's that, living as a Filipino American in the capital?
It's a very diverse community. So I think it's kind of like, oh, everyone's from somewhere.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. Well, we want to be respectful of your time, but we got a couple more questions.
Sure.
Here in the podcast, we're always talking about, rituals that you can do. So I wanted to, and a ritual can be anything from it can be spiritual, could be non-spiritual, just anything that kind of like clears your mind. Or maybe you can talk about maybe your writing rituals. Do you have a ritual you do before you start writing? Or what are some rituals that support you?
Yeah, I'd love to know how you, I mean, you mentioned the program, but how did you stay so disciplined to write a book for, any aspiring writers out there who's struggling? So, yeah.
It took a while for me with the writing, because when you have like a regular job and then you have to do this on the side, and you have, and then I had to like do a lot of reading and research. I was telling my husband like, oh, like, the other like historians that write books, they probably have like somebody helping them with the research and all that. And I had to kind of do it by myself.
Yeah.
And my friend Jen, who kind of helped me with having to have somebody to discuss the stories with. But like in terms of rituals, my personal rituals, like every morning when we walk the dogs, I kind of enjoy that. Walking in nature and walking out in the sun, kind of the first thing that we do in the morning. I really enjoy that. And then I always enjoy like my showers. I love being in water, and I realize like, oh, it's not me. It's not I'm being wasteful of water. It's my ancestors loved the water and this connection to water. And some, little peculiarities with like, it was, and if you read that chapter, you'll see about when they talk about how Europeans during that time viewed water differently from how Filipinos viewed water. And how you're talking about the islands, we have 7,000 islands in the Philippines, and how water connected the islands, whereas others saw it as separating the islands. So there's this connection that we have with water.
Wow.
And I don't know about you. I mean, I've always kind of lived in cities where I need to see water or a body of water, and I feel calmer when I'm around a body of water. So I think that kind of helps me in terms of like being around in nature is something that kind of helps me kind of think, and I guess part of my spiritual rituals.
Nice.
For the writing, it was just kind of trying to get the first word out there. I think I called them my ugly rough drafts because they were really bad. And then you kind of like, and I've kind of learned that too now at work when I do kind of a little bit of writing at work too. So I start with an outline or just a draft, and then revise. I always started with like really long stories, and then edit, and then also have some trusted friends who can help you, give you feedback. One of my, I guess, beta readers was this friend who's not Filipino, but he's a researcher for one of the big consulting firms. And he will tell you like straight to your face and be very honest, like, okay, this is garbage, or this, you need this, or this is bad and stuff. And I really appreciated that, to have feedback. And my husband too was a really big supporter, kind of encouraging me to keep writing and kind of giving me ideas. He was also like helping me edit out stories, kind of make them more cohesive. I don't think I would have done finishing the book and getting it published without the help of like everybody around. So again, it's like a very Filipino project, right? Like a whole community together, banding together, bayanihan, kind of lifting up the house together. So it's kind of in our spirit, in our nature to like help each other.
That's so cool. That's beautiful.
I have a question about you saying cutting out stories. And I love to like be able to sit with, elders across the diaspora that like can share storytelling, right? So do you have maybe a short one you could think of that was cut and you could share with us and the listeners?
There's a lot. Trying to think. There was one story that I read, talking about Babaylans. There was one story that I read, and it's online. You can find it on the internet. There was a Babaylan and another woman who was, I guess, supportive of the colonial government, I would say. And they kind of came head to head against each other. And I think in the end, like, obviously, the colonial government will come out winning in the end. But there was that one story, I didn't know where to put that, story. So I was like, oh, I don't know where to put this, but it was like, it would have been nice to have like more women characters, right? To think about, but they didn't really have that, because a lot of the sources of material are usually by, the government or men who are writing these stories.
Yeah.
So that was kind of sad. Let me try to find a positive story, maybe that would be interesting.
So it was like it was a Babaylan, were they a gendered woman or non-binary?
The Babaylan are usually women.
And then it was colonized. Was she Filipino too?
Yes, there were both Filipinas. And, I think that was what's kind of interesting about pre-colonial culture, where women had a role. I think one of the things I wanted to write about was when I was talking about the history of Sky Woman, indigenous wisdom, believing in women being the start of Earth. In Filipino culture, I think we learn about this. There's many different stories in different, I guess, parts of the Philippines about how the Earth started.
Right.
And there's the story of the first man, the first woman. I think you've heard about that story.
Yeah. The bamboo.
Yeah. And how they came out together. If you look at the story of Adam and Eve, like Eve comes from like Adam.
Right.
So women have always been kind of like coming after Adam. Because Eve came after Adam, but in the Filipino culture, it was Adam, the first man and woman, malakas and maganda, or whatever their names were, came out of the bamboo together. So that was kind of interesting. I thought, like how perceptions of origin stories kind of shape how people see our roles in culture. So in like pre-colonial Philippines, Babaylan, which were mostly women, or actually men who were dressed like women,
right?
Too, they had a role in society. They were seen as the healers,
right?
The ones who like blessed the offerings. So everybody had a role. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And unfortunately, I was looking for a way to kind of like weave that into, because Pigafetta did have a story of when he observed some women who were blessing their offerings. But I was trying to find a way to weave that into the story and have something come out of it.
Yeah.
I think one of the stories I had to kind of take out. There were more stories after Legazpi that I wanted to kind of add, but I had to like say, okay, I have to like cut it at this time. Maybe a second book. I don't know.
Yeah. There you go.
If I have time to like research some more, because there's lots of stories like, for example, like how we all ended up with Spanish sounding last names.
Yeah.
One of the governors said, okay, everybody will now have Spanish last names. If you're from this town, these are all the last names you can pick, so they can trace the migration of people from one town to another.
Oh, okay.
There were things like that. So it was kind of interesting, like, we never really talk about that. And then how our concept of time, sometimes there's now the mixing of Spanish words and pre-colonial Filipino words kind of mixed together, and how when it's a pre-colonial word, it's usually related to like nature. Like araw is something that's, I think it's maybe more like pre-colonial, or one. It's nature related words are like pre-colonial Filipino words.
Okay.
And then things for counting are more like Spanish words.
Interesting.
So that was kind of interesting how, the mixing of two things together.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. So are you inspired to maybe do a second book, or is there something else that, from pre-colonial Philippines or history that you want to maybe write about one day?
I was really fascinated by the stories of, I think one of my aha moments too was the Manila Galleons.
Okay.
Which we kind of didn't really talk about in our history books in the Philippines, how this trade between the Philippines and Acapulco, so Manila and Acapulco, the Manila Galleons, which I talk about in the chapter that I think the last two chapters were kind of my favorite to write. Okay. In some ways, because they were after 1521, 1565, but there was this trade between Manila and Acapulco, bringing stuff back and forth together. It started because Legazpi arrived in the Philippines and they found a way back to Mexico. And it spanned for like maybe 2 centuries of like back and forth.
Wow.
And because of that, the Philippines connected, like it was true that the Philippines was connected to the rest of the world. So that's something that I want to learn more about, is the galleon trade that happened between the two countries. It was because, you know, like we have things like chocolate in the Philippines that came from Mexico, and then mangoes from the Philippines that went to Mexico. So it's like the back and forth trade.
Yeah. And how those different cultures, like we traded things, probably like food, like you said, and like just other, that'd be really interesting, like all the nuances of that.
Yes. And so I didn't really realize how Mexico had a big impact on our own history. Because we never really talked about that. It's just like, oh, it's Spain, but everybody that had to come from Spain had to stop over in Mexico. And then they made the trip from Mexico to the Philippines.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I mean,
that would be
thinking about travel and how, you know, back how they had to navigate back then. They didn't have, you know, all the technology we have now, and it makes sense. So so much information still out there. It sounds like so much to still connect the dots, but we just so appreciate, like, this is a wealth of knowledge, and we thank you so much for putting it together and just putting it out there. And it's been a privilege to meet you and to hear about what your process was and potential other stuff coming out. But with our listeners, is there any way that they can contact you or find you, or if they have any questions?
Sure. I have my Instagram, which I have to keep, like, I have to update. The funny thing is I'm a kind of a private person, and that's one of my hesitations about writing the book was like, ooh, I got to write about myself. Because originally when I was writing, I didn't want it to be like a typical history book where you're just talking about the stories. I wanted to be able to share and make it different, and share like what I thought when I was reading the stories. To kind of make it a little more relatable. I thought about my nephews and nieces, right? Like, okay, this is a book that they would read. If it's just like a book that they have to read for school, then they probably won't read it. So I had to kind of share my insights of like, oh, this was kind of interesting. So then I have that. And then I started an Instagram account related to the book. It's Judy Robinson Stories.
Okay.
And so they can reach me there. I will try to go and update some more. Hopefully in March, I can start like paying attention to that again. I really enjoy listening to your podcasts. I love hearing your reactions to the different stories, because everyone has, and I love when you talk about like the vocabulary and you talk about the codes, because it kind of talks about how different things speak to us. When certain stories happen, right? Like we see it differently. And I think that's kind of like what I was trying to get at with the book too, where it's not just one story, but many stories, because we all have different ways of seeing things. So I really enjoy hearing your points of view and your take on the different stories. But yes, the listeners can reach me through my Instagram, and I will make sure to respond. And thank you for the support. I really appreciate it.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you so much, Ate, for your work and for taking the time to speak with us. This is an interview we were so happy to be able to do since we're reading. So thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you.